Imagine walking through the streets of the most powerful empire the world had ever known, not as a citizen, but as a spectacle. Your body covered in blood and excrement, chains cutting into your wrists, guards shoving you forward as thousands of eyes burn into your flesh. This was not simply execution. This was something far more calculated, far more cruel. The Roman Empire did not just kill its condemned. It destroyed them first, piece by piece, in front of everyone they had ever known. What you are about to hear goes beyond the gladiatorial combat we see in films. This is the story of damnatio ad bestias and the public shame rituals that made death seem like mercy. The year is 64 CE, and Rome stands at the height of its power. Emperor Nero rules from his golden palace while the city sprawls beneath him, a maze of marble temples, crowded insulae, and blood-soaked sand. The Colosseum would not be completed for another decade, but the Circus Maximus and other arenas already served as theaters of state violence. Roman society operated on a strict hierarchy where honor meant everything and shame meant annihilation. The concept of dignitas, personal dignity and social standing, was the foundation of Roman identity. To strip someone of their dignitas publicly was to erase them from existence more completely than any sword ever could. The state understood this power and wielded it with deliberate precision. Public executions in Rome were never merely about punishment. They were performances, carefully choreographed to send messages that echoed through every level of society. When someone was condemned to damnatio ad bestias, they were sentenced not just to death by wild animals, but to a journey of systematic humiliation designed to break their spirit before their body was torn apart. The process began days before the actual execution, in the darkness of Rome's underground prisons. The Tullianum, Rome's most notorious dungeon, sat beneath the Forum in a stone chamber where prisoners awaited their fate in complete darkness, knee-deep in filth and the remains of previous occupants. Here, the condemned would receive their first taste of what was to come. The preparation ritual was methodical and cruel. Guards, specially trained in the psychology of humiliation, would strip the condemned of their clothing and any remaining dignity. For women, this process was particularly brutal. They would be shaved completely, their hair soiled or burned, removing the last symbol of their femininity and status. Their bodies would then be marked with pitch or paint, identifying their crimes in crude letters across their skin. These markings served a dual purpose. They informed the crowd of the transgression, and they branded the condemned as less than human. The night before the spectacle, prisoners received no food, only enough water to keep them conscious. Weakness made them easier to control, but more importantly, it made the performance last longer. When dawn broke on the day of execution, the condemned would be brought from their cells and chained together in a procession. This was the beginning of the pompa, the public parade through Rome's streets that transformed punishment into citywide entertainment. The route was never random. It was carefully planned to maximize exposure and humiliation, winding through the busiest markets, past the temples where the condemned may have once worshipped, and through neighborhoods where their families lived. The crowd that gathered was not passive. Romans were encouraged to participate actively in the humiliation. They threw rotting vegetables, human waste and stones at the condemned. They shouted insults and mockery, competing to see who could devise the cruelest taunt. Children were brought to watch, taught that this was justice, that this was what happened to those who broke Rome's laws. The guards understood timing and psychology. They would stop the procession at strategic intervals, forcing the condemned to stand motionless while the crowd's fury intensified. At these stops, heralds would read the crimes aloud, embellishing them with theatrical flourish. A woman accused of adultery might be described as a serpent who corrupted the virtue of Roman manhood. A man who questioned imperial authority might be labeled a traitor to the gods themselves, an enemy of everything sacred. The language was designed to dehumanize, to make the crowd believe that what they were witnessing was not the torture of a human being, but the righteous destruction of a monster. This rhetoric was essential to maintaining public support for what was, in essence, state-sponsored terrorism. Family members of the condemned faced an impossible choice during these parades. Roman law sometimes required relatives to participate in the humiliation or face punishment themselves. Fathers might be forced to spit on their daughters. Wives might be commanded to throw stones at their husbands. This served multiple purposes for the state. It fragmented family units that might otherwise seek vengeance. It demonstrated that loyalty to Rome superseded all other bonds. And most insidiously, it spread the trauma and guilt throughout the community, making everyone complicit in the violence. Those who refused to participate were noted by authorities, their names recorded for potential future action. The message was clear. There was no neutrality, no safe distance from the state's power. As the procession neared the arena, the condemned would see the massive structure looming before them, its walls echoing with the roar of the crowd already assembled inside. The amphitheaters of Rome were architectural marvels, designed not just for viewing but for amplifying sound and spectacle. Every sightline had been calculated, every entrance and exit planned for maximum dramatic effect. The condemned would be held in the hypogum, the underground network of tunnels and cages beneath the arena floor. Here they would wait in darkness, listening to the sounds above, the cheering, the animal roars, the screams of those who had gone before them. This psychological torture was intentional. Fear was part of the punishment, and the wait in that suffocating blackness, knowing what was coming, broke many before they ever reached the sand. The crimes that led to damnatio ad bestias varied, but they shared common threads. They threatened Roman power, social order, or religious authority. Adultery, particularly for women, was considered a crime against the state because it threatened the legitimacy of inheritance and family lineage. Women convicted of adultery were often sentenced to the harshest public humiliations. Their sexuality, which they had allegedly used to corrupt Roman men, would be put on display as proof of their depravity. But political dissent drew even more elaborate punishments. Those who spoke against the emperor or questioned imperial policy were labeled traitors, not just to Rome, but to the gods who supposedly sanctioned Roman rule. Religious crimes, such as refusing to honor the state gods or practicing forbidden religions, were treated as existential threats to the empire's divine mandate. The arena performances themselves were carefully scripted productions that blended execution with theatrical spectacle. Women condemned for adultery or other sexual crimes might be forced to reenact mythological scenes, stripped naked and cast in the role of figures like Pasiphae, who in legend mated with a bull. These reenactments were not merely symbolic. Real animals were involved, and the condemned were genuinely harmed or killed in the process of creating these grotesque tableaus. The crowds loved these performances because they satisfied multiple desires simultaneously: the appetite for violence, the enjoyment of sexual spectacle, and the comfort of seeing their moral worldview reinforced through the punishment of the supposedly wicked. The editors, those who organized the games, competed to create the most innovative and shocking displays. The animals used in these executions were exotic and terrifying. Lions, bears, leopards, wild boars, and bulls were imported from across the empire at enormous expense. These beasts were deliberately starved and sometimes tortured before being released into the arena, making them more aggressive and unpredictable. The condemned might be tied to stakes or suspended from frames, unable to defend themselves or even move. Sometimes they were given wooden swords or clubs, useless against clawed predators, but providing the illusion of a fight, which the crowd enjoyed more than simple slaughter. The technical expertise required to stage these events was substantial. Trapdoors, pulley systems, and ramps allowed animals to appear suddenly, adding an element of surprise that heightened the spectacle. The entire infrastructure of the Roman arena was designed to facilitate creative cruelty. The crowd's role in these executions extended beyond passive observation. In some cases, spectators were given the power to vote on the specific methods of torture or the types of animals to be used. They would shout their preferences, and the editor would attempt to accommodate the majority. This participatory element was crucial to the ritual's social function. It transformed the audience from witnesses into accomplices, binding them together in collective violence and collective moral judgment. When tens of thousands of people simultaneously approve of someone's torture, it creates a powerful social consensus that such actions are not just acceptable, but righteous. The arena became a space where Roman values were not just displayed, but actively created and reinforced through shared brutality. Emperors understood the political power of these spectacles and exploited them ruthlessly. Caligula, whose reign from 37 to 41 CE was marked by extravagant cruelty, personally designed execution scenarios and sometimes participated in them. Historical accounts describe him ordering the slaughter of entire sections of the crowd when the games ran short of condemned prisoners, blurring the line between audience and victim. He reportedly enjoyed watching people being sawn in half or fed to animals during dinner parties, treating human suffering as casual entertainment. Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 CE, took these displays even further. He staged elaborate mythological reenactments involving sexual violence and used Christians as human torches to light his garden parties. For these emperors, public executions were not just about maintaining order, but about demonstrating absolute power and their own godlike status above human morality. The scale of these operations was staggering. Records suggest that during the inaugural games of the Colosseum in 80 CE, under Emperor Titus, approximately 5,000 animals and countless human beings were killed over 100 days of continuous spectacle. The logistics of capturing, transporting, and maintaining these animals, along with managing the prisoners, required a vast bureaucratic infrastructure. Special hunters called venatores traveled to the far reaches of the empire to capture exotic beasts. Ships were retrofitted to transport elephants and rhinoceroses. Underground the arenas, teams of workers operated the machinery that raised animals and prisoners to the arena floor at precise moments. This was not chaotic barbarism, but organized, state-sponsored violence executed with industrial efficiency. Among all the forms of execution Rome devised, perhaps none carried more ritualistic weight than the punishment reserved for Vestal virgins who broke their vows of chastity. The Vestals held a unique position in Roman society. These priestesses, chosen as children from noble families, served the goddess Vesta for 30 years, maintaining the sacred fire that symbolized Rome's eternal survival. Their virginity was considered essential to Rome's security and prosperity. A Vestal who engaged in sexual relations was believed to threaten the entire empire's existence, bringing divine wrath upon the city. The punishment for this crime reflected its perceived severity and combined ancient religious dread with calculated public humiliation. When a Vestal virgin was accused of breaking her vow, the trial itself became a public spectacle. The proceedings took place before the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, in a ceremony loaded with religious symbolism. If found guilty, the Vestal was declared dead in the eyes of the gods, even before her actual execution. This legal death meant she ceased to exist as a person with rights or identity. What followed was designed to be worse than any quick death. The condemned Vestal was stripped of her religious garments, which were torn rather than removed to symbolize the violation of her sacred status. She was then dressed in funeral clothes while still alive, a practice that psychologically transformed her into a living corpse. The symbolism was deliberate. She had killed Rome's sacred flame through her actions, so Rome would bury her alive in return. The procession that carried the condemned Vestal to her fate was conducted in complete silence. Unlike the raucous parades for common criminals, this march was funereal and eerie. The Vestal was placed in a covered litter, hidden from view as if already dead, and carried through the streets while citizens watched in horrified quiet. The destination was the Campus Sceleratus, the Evil Field, a location near the Colline Gate where a small underground chamber had been prepared. This chamber was not simply a hole in the ground. It was an engineered space, carefully designed to prolong the victim's suffering while maintaining the fiction that Rome was not directly killing her. The Romans believed that spilling a Vestal's blood or executing her openly would bring divine punishment, so they created a method that technically allowed her to die of natural causes while ensuring those causes were as slow and agonizing as possible. The chamber itself measured roughly 10 feet by 10 feet and was accessed by a ladder. Inside, a small bed was placed along with a lamp, a little bread, water, and milk. These items served a cruel purpose. They provided just enough sustenance to keep the Vestal alive for several days underground, extending her suffering while maintaining the pretense that Rome was giving her a chance to survive through divine intervention. The chamber's construction revealed sophisticated understanding of acoustics and psychology. Its dimensions and materials were chosen to amplify sound, meaning every cry, every sob, every prayer would echo back upon the victim, intensifying her psychological torture. Some historical accounts suggest that emperors or priests would visit the site during the days following the burial, listening to the sounds emanating from below ground as confirmation that the punishment was proceeding as intended. The actual burial ceremony was brief and ritualistic. The Vestal would be forced to climb down the ladder into the chamber. Once she reached the bottom, the ladder would be removed and the opening sealed with earth and stone. No final words were permitted. No appeals could be heard. The high priests would perform purification rituals at the site, symbolically cleansing Rome of the pollution her crime had caused. Then they would walk away, leaving her in absolute darkness and silence, buried alive beneath the city she had served since childhood. The psychological horror of this death is difficult to comprehend. The victim remained conscious and aware as her oxygen slowly depleted, as hunger and thirst took hold, as the darkness became complete and eternal. She would die over the course of days, her cries heard by no one, except perhaps those who came to listen to her suffering. Historical records document several such executions, each demonstrating how this punishment served political as well as religious purposes. In 216 BCE, during Rome's darkest hour in the Second Punic War, after the catastrophic defeat at Cannae, 2 Vestals were accused and buried alive as scapegoats for Rome's military failures. The timing was not coincidental. The state needed to explain why the gods had abandoned Rome, and violating the sacred virginity of the Vestals provided a convenient explanation that shifted blame away from military and political leadership. In 114 BCE, 3 Vestals were condemned simultaneously, creating such public controversy that it sparked debates about the justice of the practice. Yet the executions proceeded anyway, demonstrating that even when Romans questioned the morality of their methods, political and religious authority prevailed over compassion or reason. The physical effects of this death were documented by Roman writers with clinical detachment that reveals their culture's capacity to normalize horror. The victim would first experience intense claustrophobia and panic as the reality of her situation set in. Within hours, the limited oxygen in the sealed chamber would begin to deplete, causing headaches, confusion, and difficulty breathing. The small amount of food and water provided was insufficient to sustain life, but enough to prolong consciousness and suffering. By the second day, dehydration would cause intense thirst, dizziness, and delirium. The victim might try to dig at the walls or ceiling, breaking fingernails and bloodying her hands in futile attempts to escape. By the third or fourth day, severe dehydration and oxygen deprivation would lead to organ failure, hallucinations, and finally death. Throughout this process, the victim remained fully aware of what was happening to her, experiencing every moment of her slow extinction. The psychological dimensions of this punishment extended beyond the victim to the entire society. The knowledge that such a fate existed, that the state had the power and will to bury a person alive, created an atmosphere of terror that enforced conformity. Young girls chosen to become Vestals understood that a single mistake could lead to this end. Their families, elevated in status by having a daughter serve as a Vestal, also bore the weight of this knowledge. The punishment served as a constant reminder that no one, regardless of social standing or sacred status, was beyond the reach of Roman power. It demonstrated that the state could reach into the most holy spaces, could condemn even those who served the gods, and could do so with the full approval of both religious and civic authority. Beyond the Vestals, Rome's use of public humiliation as a weapon extended to foreign dignitaries and conquered peoples. When Rome defeated foreign nations, captured queens and noblewomen were often subjected to public degradation as a demonstration of Roman supremacy. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, famously chose suicide over being paraded through Rome in chains, knowing the humiliation that awaited her. Her choice illustrates the terror that Rome's shame rituals inspired even among the powerful. Those who did not escape through death faced systematic degradation designed not just to punish individuals, but to crush entire cultures and peoples. Conquered leaders would be stripped, chained and forced to walk behind the triumphal chariot of the Roman general who defeated them, while crowds jeered and threw refuse. The triumph ceremony itself was a masterclass in organized humiliation. These elaborate parades celebrating military victories included the display of captured enemies, looted treasures, and paintings depicting Roman victories in battle. The foreign leaders and warriors forced to participate were dressed in chains, but sometimes also in mockeries of their traditional royal garments, creating a visual representation of their culture's degradation. After the triumph, these prisoners faced various fates, but many were executed in the arena using the same methods applied to Roman criminals. The message was clear: Roman power was absolute, and no culture, no matter how ancient or sophisticated, could resist it. The humiliation of foreign royalty served diplomatic purposes as well, warning other nations of what awaited them if they challenged Rome. The sexualized nature of much of this public violence reveals how Rome weaponized gender and sexuality as tools of domination. Women's bodies became battlegrounds for demonstrating Roman values and Roman power. The public stripping and sexual humiliation of women convicted of moral crimes was not incidental to their punishment, but central to it. Roman society was obsessed with female sexuality as something that needed to be controlled and contained within strict legal and social boundaries. Women who transgressed these boundaries threatened the patriarchal order, and their punishment had to visibly reinforce that order by displaying the consequences of female sexual autonomy. The arena became a space where male power over female bodies was demonstrated through ritualized violence that was simultaneously legal, religious, and entertaining. The mechanics of these sexualized executions were documented in contemporary sources with disturbing detail. Women might be bound to artificial bulls or other devices that facilitated sexual assault by animals or by criminals condemned to die alongside them. These scenarios, presented as reenactments of mythology, allowed the crowd to witness sexual violence while maintaining the fiction that they were watching theatrical performance rather than torture. The psychological impact on the victims was compounded by the public nature of the assault. They were being destroyed not in private, but before thousands, their degradation witnessed and approved by an entire society. The knowledge that their suffering was entertainment, that people were cheering and laughing, added a layer of existential horror to the physical pain. The infrastructure supporting these spectacles was vast and sophisticated. Beneath the arenas, workers maintained the systems that made the executions possible. These were skilled laborers who understood timing, dramatics, and the technical requirements of raising animals and prisoners to the arena floor at precise moments. They operated in the dim, blood-soaked tunnels beneath the sand, surrounded by caged beasts and desperate prisoners. This workforce of executioners, animal handlers, and stage managers was essential to the functioning of Roman justice and entertainment. They represented the bureaucratic normalization of cruelty, the administrative machinery that transformed human suffering into state policy. These workers likely became desensitized to the violence they facilitated, viewing it as simply a job, a means of survival in an empire built on conquest and domination. The economic aspects of these executions reveal how deeply embedded they were in Roman society. The games and executions required enormous financial investment. Capturing and transporting exotic animals cost fortunes. Training and maintaining gladiators required schools and equipment. Building and operating the arenas demanded skilled architects and engineers. All of this was funded by the state, by wealthy sponsors seeking popularity, or by successful generals distributing war plunder. The economic incentives created a powerful institutional momentum that made the practice difficult to stop, even when moral objections arose. Too many people's livelihoods depended on the continuation of the games. Vendors sold food and souvenirs. Betting networks organized wagers on the outcomes. Prostitutes worked the crowds. The arena was the center of an entire economy built on blood. The religious justification for these practices cannot be understated. Romans believed they were enacting divine will through these executions. The criminals had offended the gods, and the public punishment restored cosmic order. Prayers were offered before major executions, and priests interpreted omens from the manner of death. If a condemned person died with particular courage, or if an animal behaved unusually, these signs were read as messages from the divine realm. This religious framework transformed what might otherwise be recognized as sadism into a sacred duty, a necessary ritual for maintaining the gods' favor and protecting Rome from divine wrath. When violence is sacralized, it becomes nearly impossible to question, because opposition to the practice becomes opposition to the gods themselves. The transformation of private vengeance into public spectacle was a deliberate choice by Roman authorities. In earlier periods and in other cultures, crimes might be avenged by victims' families or communities in relatively private acts of retaliation. Rome systematized and centralized this violence, claiming a monopoly on legitimate force and then staging that force as mass entertainment. This served to prevent private feuds that might destabilize society, while simultaneously strengthening state power through the demonstration of its capacity for overwhelming violence. Citizens learned that only the state had the authority to punish, and they learned that the state's punishments were too terrible to risk. The arena was where abstract state power became visceral reality, where every citizen could see and hear and smell what happened to those who challenged Rome. As Christianity began to spread through the empire, it brought with it a radically different set of values that eventually challenged the moral foundations of the arena. Christians preached forgiveness, the inherent dignity of every human soul, and the wrongness of murder regardless of state sanction. Early Christians were themselves victims of arena executions, thrown to animals or burned alive for refusing to honor the Roman gods. Their willingness to die rather than participate in Roman religious rituals and the courage many displayed in facing death created a propaganda problem for Roman authorities. The spectacle of Christians dying peacefully, praying for their executioners, sometimes troubled even hardened arena audiences. These deaths were supposed to reinforce Roman power, but instead they demonstrated a different kind of strength and raised uncomfortable questions about the justice of the system. The decline of the arena spectacles was gradual and contested. Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century began a process of legal and cultural change. But gladiatorial games and public executions continued for decades afterward. The practices were too deeply embedded in Roman culture to be eliminated quickly. Economic interests resisted change. Traditionalists argued that abandoning the games would anger the old gods and weaken Rome. Crowds continued to demand the entertainment to which they had become accustomed. It took repeated imperial edicts, the physical destruction or conversion of some arenas into churches, and a generational shift in values before these practices finally ended. The last recorded gladiatorial game occurred in 404 CE, and the last recorded execution by animals in the arena took place in 523 CE, though some regional variations may have continued longer in remote parts of the former empire. The legacy of Roman arena culture extended far beyond the empire's fall. The physical ruins of the Colosseum and other amphitheaters remained as monuments to this dark chapter of human history. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans grappled with this legacy, simultaneously admiring Roman civilization's achievements while struggling to reconcile them with Christian values. The arena's influence can be seen in medieval public executions, which retained elements of theatrical spectacle and crowd participation, even as the specific methods changed. The notion that criminal justice should include public humiliation and that communities should witness and approve of state violence persisted through centuries of European history, from public hangings to stocks and pillories. Perhaps most disturbing is the archaeological evidence of how Romans decorated their homes with imagery from the arena. Mosaics depicting executions, gladiatorial combat, and animal hunts adorned the floors and walls of wealthy Roman homes. These were not hidden away, but displayed prominently in rooms where guests would see them. This reveals that Romans did not experience cognitive dissonance about the violence they witnessed and endorsed. They saw it as beautiful, as worthy of artistic representation, as something to showcase with pride. Children grew up walking across these images daily, normalizing the violence they depicted. The arena was not separate from everyday Roman life, but woven into its aesthetic, moral, and social fabric. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Romans to embrace these practices are the same mechanisms that allow any society to normalize cruelty. First, the dehumanization of victims through language and ritual that portrays them as less than human, as deserving of their fate. Second, the diffusion of responsibility through collective participation, where individual guilt is dissolved into crowd mentality. Third, the authorization by authority figures and institutions that legitimize the violence as necessary and right. Fourth, the gradual escalation, where each new level of cruelty becomes normal before the next increase. Fifth, the interweaving of violence with positive experiences like entertainment and social bonding. These mechanisms are not unique to ancient Rome. They appear whenever societies engage in systematic cruelty, from medieval witch burnings to modern forms of public shaming and mass punishment. The question we must confront is whether our own society is truly different, or whether we have simply changed the methods while retaining the impulse. Public humiliation in the digital age can destroy lives as thoroughly as the arena, albeit without physical violence. The mob mentality of social media, where thousands unite to attack individuals who have transgressed social norms, echoes the crowd dynamics of the Colosseum. The entertainment value extracted from others' suffering, now through reality television and viral videos of people at their worst moments, reflects the same appetite that filled Roman arenas. The difference is not one of kind, but of degree and technology. We tell ourselves we are more civilized, but we must ask whether we have eliminated the underlying mechanisms of public cruelty or merely found more acceptable outlets for them. The arena's most enduring lesson is how easily humans can be conditioned to accept and even celebrate suffering when it is framed as justice, entertainment, or necessity. The Romans were not monsters fundamentally different from us. They were people who created institutions and cultures that normalized systematic cruelty, and those institutions shaped how they thought about morality, justice, and human dignity. They raised children in a world where these spectacles were normal, where opposing them might mark someone as weak or subversive. Over generations, the capacity for moral resistance atrophied, and what once might have shocked became routine. This is the truly terrifying legacy of the arena. Not that humans are capable of such cruelty, but that we are capable of making it ordinary. Understanding Rome's arena culture requires acknowledging the fragility of the moral progress we believe we have made. The abolition of these practices did not result from Romans suddenly becoming more compassionate people, but from a long, contested political and religious transformation that faced enormous resistance. And even after formal abolition, public executions with elements of spectacle and humiliation continued in Christian Europe for over 1,000 years. The impulse to punish publicly, to make examples of transgressors, to bond communities through shared witnessing of state violence did not disappear when the arenas closed. It found new forms and new justifications, adapted to new religious and political frameworks, but retained its essential character. The archaeological and historical records of these practices serve as evidence that must not be forgotten or minimized. The bone fragments found in arena drains, the engineering specifications for trapdoors and animal cages, the legal documents authorizing specific executions, the artistic representations in homes and public spaces, all of these confirm that this was not mere legend or exaggeration, but documented reality. Thousands of human beings died in these ways, their suffering witnessed and approved by millions more. The scale and systematization of the cruelty distinguishes it from other forms of historical violence. This was not war, not crime, not spontaneous brutality, but carefully organized state policy executed with precision and celebrated with festivals. The stories of individual victims are mostly lost to history, their names unrecorded, their perspectives silenced by the very system that killed them. We know the names of emperors and gladiators, of wealthy sponsors and famous executioners, but the countless women forced into mythological reenactments, the condemned who walked the shame parades, the Vestals buried alive, most remain anonymous. This anonymity was part of their punishment, the final erasure of their existence from historical memory. Yet their absence speaks volumes. In the gaps and silences of the historical record, we can sense the magnitude of suffering that was deemed too ordinary to document individually. The arena's victims were so numerous, their deaths so routine, that historians recorded only the exceptions, the unusual cases that deviated from the standard brutality. Modern society's relationship with this history is complex and often troubling. Tourist attractions now occupy sites of mass murder, and visitors take photographs where people once died in agony. The Colosseum is one of Rome's most popular tourist destinations, celebrated as an architectural marvel, while its function as an execution facility is sometimes sanitized or romanticized. This is not necessarily wrong. Preservation of historical sites serves important educational purposes. But it requires mindful engagement with what these spaces represent. They are monuments not just to Roman engineering, but to human capacity for organized cruelty. Walking through the Colosseum should inspire reflection on how societies normalize violence and on our own culture's relationship with punishment, spectacle, and public shaming. The academic study of these practices faces its own challenges. Historians must balance accurate documentation of what occurred with avoiding sensationalism or inadvertent glorification of the violence. There is danger in focusing too heavily on the spectacular and brutal aspects of Roman culture, while neglecting its many other dimensions. Yet there is equal danger in minimizing or explaining away these practices, in treating them as mere curiosities rather than central features of Roman life. The arena was not an aberration, but an expression of values deeply embedded in Roman culture: hierarchy, honor, state power, religious duty, and the belief that some lives held less value than others. Understanding this requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how easily sophisticated civilizations can embrace systematic cruelty. The end of the arena spectacles marked not the triumph of human compassion, but the replacement of one value system with another that had its own forms of sanctioned violence. Christian medieval Europe abolished damnatio ad bestias, but created the Inquisition, witch trials, and brutal public executions for heresy. The methods changed, but the underlying structure of using public violence as a tool of social control persisted. This suggests that the problem lies deeper than any particular set of practices, rooted in the human tendency to divide people into categories of worthy and unworthy, to believe that some deserve protection while others deserve punishment, and to find satisfaction in the destruction of those deemed other. Until we confront these underlying impulses, we remain vulnerable to creating new versions of the arena suited to our own time and technology. The testimony of those few who spoke against these practices, even in their own time, demonstrates that the moral clarity to recognize this cruelty as wrong existed even within Roman culture. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, wrote critically of the games, describing them as brutalizing to spectators as well as victims. Some emperors tried to limit the worst excesses, though usually for pragmatic rather than moral reasons. Early Christians articulated a vision of human dignity that fundamentally opposed the arena's logic. These voices were minority positions, often ignored or suppressed, but their existence proves that recognizing the wrong of such practices does not require modern sensibilities. The moral knowledge was available. What was lacking was the political will and cultural framework to act on that knowledge and prioritize human dignity over state power and mass entertainment. In the end, the story of Rome's public shame rituals is a story about power and its expression through the bodies of the powerless. It is about how societies create rituals that transform cruelty into meaning, violence into entertainment, and human suffering into moral lessons. It is about the distance between how a culture sees itself and the truth revealed by its treatment of those it deems unworthy. Rome saw itself as bringing civilization, law, and order to a chaotic world, and in many ways it did. But it also created industrial-scale systems for destroying human dignity and normalized them so thoroughly that generations of Romans never questioned whether these practices might be wrong. This is the arena's truest legacy, not the specific methods of torture and execution, but the demonstration that any society, no matter how sophisticated, can make the unthinkable seem normal if doing so serves the interests of those in power. The spectacles ended more than 15 centuries ago, but the impulses that created them remain. The human capacity for cruelty has not diminished, nor has the tendency of power to express itself through the domination and humiliation of the powerless. Our methods are different, our justifications have evolved, but we must constantly examine whether we have truly moved beyond the arena's logic or simply found more palatable ways to enact it. Every time a society creates spectacles of public punishment, every time crowds gather to witness someone's destruction, every time we find entertainment in others' suffering, we are walking in the Colosseum's shadow. The question is, whether we will recognize ourselves in that history and choose a different path, or whether future generations will look back at our own practices with the same horror and incomprehension we now feel for ancient Rome.